Hello, my name is Kern and welcome to a very different kind of video for the channel. Instead of a unique kind of deck guide around some crazy but still competitive brew, I have for you something different. It is a discussion about theory and what I could consider to even be a sixth archetype of Magic. So what do I mean when I say archetype? Well, take mono white weenies, for example. That is a deck that plays white spells, they're small creatures, and it wins with an aggressive strategy. It is a form of aggro. When I say archetype, I don't mean mono white weenies as a description of like a specific deck. I mean aggro, like the more general deck strategy. So not everybody considers there to be 5 archetypes in the first place. Some descriptions of these archetypes like have a wheel of 8 of them. I don't know, there's a lot of different theories out there. What are the 5 that I'm talking about? There's aggro, control, and mid-range, which sort of form this rock, paper, scissors pyramid where one is generally favored over the other. Then there's also combo and tempo. Those are the 5 that I think are the most common out there in the zeitgeist of considering the core archetypes. So why would it matter if there was a 6th one, and who even cares about, this whole conversation about archetypes? Seems so way too theoretical to be practical. And oh my god, I hope I can blow your mind with how practical a consideration this actually is, and maybe even blow your mind with, oh my god, is there really a 6th archetype? So why do we care? If we understand what archetype our deck is, that allows us to play it better, to design it better, and draw from a more general pool of wisdom. Like, what should our curve look like? What are good turn 2 and 3 plays? Where are we favored? Where are we not favored? How do we sideboard? There's a lot of supporting theory that is foundational on this idea of deck archetype. And this is where I think it becomes important to consider draw to win as a 6th archetype, because the curves look very different, the plays look very different, and it has very different properties than other types of decks, which it shares some properties too, like combo, but it's different enough that you really need to think about it in a separate way. So to kick off this discussion, let's take a look at Mono Blue Devotion, which is a deck that you might have seen before. So this deck is largely centered around Nyx Lotus, and I would describe this as a bad combo deck, which some of you might not like that because I know that some people really like Mono Blue Devotion, but I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to hurt the decks you like. I'm here to help you. Let me help you make Mono Blue Devotion better, or introduce you to a better way to play Magic than Mono Blue Devotion. So the reason it's not very good, it's never going to be a tier 1, tier 2, or maybe even tier 3 deck. It's just not quite good enough because the combo is not doing the combo thing very well. It's incredibly prone to disruption. The cards are very narrow, and it doesn't win the turn that you play the combo. It actually can't even win the turn that you play the combo in most situations. In fact, it doesn't even win the turn after that or the turn after that. It generally takes 3 or 4 turns after you've assembled the combo to win. That's part of what makes it so prone to disruption. You give your opponent a lot more opportunities to find the cards that they need to completely screw you over. What is this? How does this work if you're not familiar with it? Nyx Lotus adds an amount of mana equal to your devotion to blue. Then you have cards that add high devotion to blue, like Arcanist Owl, Gadwick, and Thassa's Oracle, and also other cards that gain advantage from devotion to blue, like Thassa's Oracle or Thassa Deep Dwelling. But yeah, mostly it's centered around having a lot of mana. Then you use that mana and dump it into Gadwick to draw that many cards. Then finally, once your library is low enough, you win the game by playing a Thassa's Oracle, or by bouncing it with, or rather flickering it with Thassa Deep Dwelling, which wins you the game. So I think the reason why this is bad is because it's not doing the combo thing very well, but it could be good, potentially. The problem with this deck isn't that it's bad combo, it's that it doesn't know that it's draw to win. It doesn't know that there are other properties that it should be taking advantage of, that there are other ways that this deck should be operating in order to be a good draw to win deck. I think it would be a fun exercise to try to take this deck and make it into a good draw to win deck. I'm not sure if that's possible in Standard, if we have the cards to do that, but if you're interested in that, let me know. I might make a video on it. But let's take a look at some of the good draw to win decks, which I think exemplify the archetype and allow us to talk about the properties in a much better way. So this is a Risen Reef self-decking list that seeks to take advantage of the card advantage that you get from Risen Reef in order to keep drawing more cards, play more Reefs, duplicate them, get that much more card draw, and then eventually win the game by playing Thassa's Oracle. So this card is incredibly good for a very important reason, and that also has to do with another theory of Magic, which is what are cards trying to do? So let's take a look at this. This is one theory about how to think about your cards. A card can either provide card advantage by drawing you more cards, It can give you tempo, which there's a lot of different forms of tempo. One of those is ramp. Another one is disruption of your opponent's board state. Another is being able to play more spells than your opponent. So those are all tempo. Finally, a card can give you progress towards your win condition. So that could just be a big creature that has trample that's going to hit your opponent in the face. It could be burn spells, or in our case, it could be like, say, self-mill would be progress towards our win condition, since our win con is having a low library. So each of the cards in Magic does one of those three things, and good cards can sometimes do multiple things. And that's why Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, is such a powerful card, is that in any Simic playing deck, it can do all of those three things. It gives some card draw, it gives a little bit of ramp as tempo, and it also is a threat to your opponent's face. It doesn't do either of those three things very well on its own, but because it does all three and it's pretty undercosted, that's why you see it in like practically every Simic deck ever. Risen Reef is very similar to that in our deck. Unlike Uro, it can't just slot into any deck. It needs to fit into a deck that can really exploit this property, since it only gets that effect when either it enters the battlefield or when another elemental enters the field. But we are taking advantage of all of that. Another important thing to consider about what this does is how it affects our curve. So this is how a lot of people design the different, or consider the different archetypes, is what the curves look like. So let's take a look at the three classic curves for aggro, mid-range, and control. Red here is progress towards win condition. Blue is the number of cards in hand. And green, I think, would be better to think about as tempo, but for here, I just labeled it as lands because that's more simple to think about. So aggro plays few lands, so that typically tops out at like 2 or maybe even 3 after turn 2 or 3. And that's as many lands as you're going to get. It just plays a lot of cheap spells to hit your face very quickly. The progress toward win condition is very, very steep, much steeper than any other curve at the beginning of the game, but then it flatlines. So if you don't win the game quickly, you're probably not going to win with aggro. And then you dump your hand onto the board, and so that just plummets, right? Mid-range is kind of similar, but it has a lot more long-term viability. As long as the game goes on longer, their cards get stronger and stronger and stronger. They can't threaten your face as quickly as aggro, but they can do just fine with top decking once they run out of cards, where aggro will really struggle. Then finally, you have control. Control is largely defined by card advantage. So you can see the blue line kind of goes down, but then it stabilizes at around 3 or 4 cards. So you're never really top decking with control. You generally have options in your hand for how you want to deal with the situation. However, your win con stays basically flatline the entire time until you get into the end game, where typically is when you play your large game winning threat and then you try to win the game. So how is this different in a draw to win deck? What does our curve look like? Wild. Look at that curve. Isn't that insane? So at the beginning of the game, the first 3, 4, 5 turns, it looks much more classical. The lines kind of cross each other. Sometimes it looks like mid-range, sometimes it looks like control, but it's a much more classical style curve. But then it exponentiates and all of the curves go up. Now, whether or not that's actually lands or it's tempo, when we're looking at that green line, it's true either way in a well-designed draw to win deck. So with that in mind, how do we accomplish that crazy curve? Well, each of the decks are going to be doing that differently. I'm going to be showing you different ways that they do that. This is how this deck does it. So Risen Reef, right, it's going to give you that progress towards win con, the card advantage, and the tempo in the form of ramp. So it's putting a lot of lands onto the field. Every time you duplicate it, that exponentiates, right? Or if you just play a Reef, that's just linear progress. Just linear progress. Linear progress in any deck is really amazing, whether it's progress in card advantage or win con or tempo or whatever. If you can get linear, oh my god. But you're exponentiating it when you're duplicating your Reefs. That's how we get that crazy curve. If you want to see this in action, I have a deck guide that's maybe 6 months old when I first designed this deck. I have a new version of the deck guide that's coming out that shows you this specific version. That'll be coming out soon. If that's here, there will be a card somewhere somewhere at the top of the screen or down in the description if you want to see how this plays out in particular. But let's take a look more generally at draw to win properties and what that means in this deck. So one of the properties of draw to win decks is that you often have cards that are prone to disruption, or that there are silver bullets against. So this has huge implications in the best of 3. This is a property that it shares with combo. So combo can also be that same way. This is why that mono blue devotion deck with Nyx Lotus is kind of bad, is because it's too prone to disruption. you need to design your deck with that in mind. What is your strategy for being disrupted? In this particular deck, the Risen Reef is the card that can very easily be disrupted or board wipes. So we designed that around that by having quasi-duplicate, so we can copy a Reef. Now they have to do single target removal against 2 of them to ruin our board state. We also have Heroic Intervention to give our cards hexproof and indestructible to protect them, and also Neoform to help tutor out another Reef after like a wipe or something like that. Another great property of draw to win cards is that they often achieve multiple goals. So again, when we're looking at the goals of cards, a lot of cards will be doing both card advantage and progress towards win condition, since our win con is card draw. But oftentimes we also have ways to take advantage of tempo as well. And I think a really well-designed draw to win deck is trying to get you tempo as well. I think that's a really key part of it. A lot of these decks have exponential curves, as we showed you before on the list. We also tend to tap out on our turn. This is not always true, but I think that this is just a side effect of trying to draw more cards, which then allows you to play more spells, to draw more cards, to play more spells. Almost all of the decks have that in common, so we tend to tap out on our turn. Being aware of that can be really good. In this particular deck, that means just understanding that, we need cheap spells to hold up if we need to hold up something on our opponent's turn. Heroic Intervention is perfect because it's only 2 mana, or free spells. So Pause for Reflection can be played for free to prevent damage from going out of face. So if we do have to play a spell on our opponent's turn, we want it to be cheap. Draw to win decks tend to be very solitaire style. So, that means that we don't really care what our opponent's doing, and that our opponent can't really interact with us very much either. In this case, the biggest way they can interact with us is target, spot removal, or they can do board wipes. But even just a single spot removal isn't going to be hugely hurtful to us after like turn 3 or 4. But we also ignore their strategy and win condition largely by playing Pause for Reflection. Most decks have the win condition of hitting you in the face, so this counters that, and that allows us to play into this solitaire style. As a side effect of having really great card advantage, that means that we have a large variety of responses and options. This is where the mono blue devotion deck falls short, is that you typically don't have flexible enough options that can do multiple things for your game. So in this case, there's a lot of micro combos in the deck. There are alternative win conditions with a single Cavalier Flame, which are incredibly viable in case we can't win by decking ourselves. And there are a lot of other cards we could be looking for outs. Like what if what we really need is to hold up protection? Then we can find a Pause for Reflection or a Heroic Intervention, that kind of thing. And finally, I would say that an important property of draw to win is a disruption of your opponent's strategy. I think if you're not disrupting your opponent's strategy, then you can't really solitaire very well, but also you're not really taking maximum advantage of your card advantage. So in this way, this is where, draw to win is more like control than it is like combo, because we have that card advantage element, and one great use of that card advantage element is to disrupt our opponent. So in this case, we're not doing a ton of disruption with this particular list. Mostly we have Pause for Reflection to fog out the game, but we also have Omnath to remove a thing sometimes. But you'll see that more so in the other lists. So let's take a look at another list and see how it stacks up here. So here is another draw to win deck designed around these principles by yours truly. This is a Song of Creation build around, which allows you to play an additional land on each of your turns, and whenever you cast a spell, draw 2 cards, but has this huge downside that at the beginning of your end step, you discard your hand. So now typically this would be played in a just full-on combo style, and this is, like I would say, somewhere in between combo and draw to win, but you really should be paying attention to these draw to win properties if you're going to design the deck in the way that I have here. So in a combo style deck, you're going to be playing Cheerios, which is a lot of 0 mana spells. 0 look like Cheerios that allow you to draw 2 cards for free. And those decks generally seek to win the turn they play Song of Creation or the turn after. So in that sense, they are good combo decks. In Standard, we don't really have as many good 0 mana spells right now. So this combo is more powerful in, say, Historic or Pioneer than it is in Standard. So in Standard, I think that we need to take a little bit of a different approach and understand that we don't need to play this deck as combo anymore, but we want to play it as draw to win. So let's go down the list that we have on the side here and see how this deck stacks up. So sometimes prone to disruption and silver bullets. That would be Song of Creation. We've designed around that by allowing us to get good enough advantage even if it gets destroyed. Also, we can win without it in pretty viable ways. We have an Uro in here, which is kind of unusual to see in this style of deck, I think. But yeah, that can go face. You can also really reliably recursively play this because you're discarding a lot of cards to your yard. You're also milling yourself a bit. So being able to escape Uro again and again and again is pretty practical. We're also ramping a bunch with Song of Creation or just with Uro himself, or sometimes just with Rosethorn Acolyte, which means that we can play bigger Stonecoil Serpents. So we could play this either as a Cheerios creature for 0 mana, or we can play this as a large enough threat that our opponent has to start taking it seriously. And finally, we have Brazen Borrower, which plays into our theme of Song of Creation, being able to cast 2 spells here to help gas us our hand some more. Brazen Borrower himself goes in the Adventure Zone, where he cannot be discarded by Song of Creation, which is really powerful. But it's also a 3-power evasive threat to add on top of Uro and Stonecoil Serpent to make our opponent defend their face a little bit. So many cards achieve multiple goals. If we look at Song of Creation, this is again doing win condition, cards, card advantage, of course, and also tempo by helping to ramp us. Exponential curve. So Song of Creation creates that for us, so can Uro. We do tend to tap out on our turn. This deck doesn't really care about that because we're discarding our hand anyway. It does have some ways to get around that, and there are some niche situations where you can play spells on your opponent's turn. But yeah, generally, we're just leaning into that thing. We want to tap out on our turn anyway to take advantage of the draw to win style of play, so who cares that we have to discard our hand, right? Solitaire style, high synergy. So this deck I would really describe much more so than the other decks as having just an insane number of micro combos and micro synergies, which means that we can really have a lot of options available to us in how we want to combo off in very different ways, even without Song of Creation. We can play Uro with discontinuity in order to keep him on the field without escaping any, or without exiling any cards from our yard. We can play Stonecoil Serpent along with the ramp that we get from Rosethorn Acolyte. We can play Unsummon on our Merfolk Secret Keeper in order to mill ourselves for more cards. There's a lot of insane synergy here that allows us to play more into the solitaire style of play. We also have a lot of variety of options. So even just looking at adventure cards, the decision between getting to play a creature or a spell is already a pretty great decision, or both, so that's also a form of card advantage. Our option is we can play this for free in order to draw us a card for Song of Creation. If we play Seasonal Ritual, then it costs a mana, we get a mana back. Or we can play it as a creature to be a blocker. Or we can play it as a creature to color fix or to ramp us. So this is a large amount of options that it's presenting us. Unsummon has huge implications. Are we bouncing our own thing to replay it, say a 0-cost Stonecoil Serpent, or 2 cards that are cheap that draws us 2 additional cards off of Song of Creation? Or are we using it to disrupt our opponent's game, either after we've gone off or before we've gone off? So we also have a huge disruption strategy as well. We have 4 Petty Theft, 3 Unsummon. Stonecoil Serpent itself, as well as Uro, being huge blockers, and Merfolk Secret Keeper being a 1 mana 4 toughness thing, can disrupt our opponent's strategy in a huge way as well. So designing our deck around these properties has allowed me to come up with what I think is a more viable way to play Song of Creation in Standard. But not all of our decks seem so much like combo as these last ones that I've showed you, and not all of our decks win by playing Thassa's Oracle or some similar effect like Jace. So let me show you a deck that kind of breaks that mold, but is still, meeting many of these draw to win properties, and I think really makes the argument for why this is a separate archetype than other archetypes like combo. So for our third and final deck that plays into this draw to win style, we have a discard and draw style deck. So another name for this is looting, like a looting mechanic. A key card here for what we're trying to do is Riel the Everwise, especially her second ability, which says whenever we discard 1 or more cards for the first time each turn, we can draw that many cards. So for however many cards we discard, we get them back. We take advantage of this in a lot of ways. Riel the Everwise herself gets +1/+0 for each instant and sorcery in our graveyard, so we can fill the card or the R for her for that. Also, we have Glinthorn Buccaneer, which gets a trigger to ping our opponent for 1 every time we discard. Nadir Kraken, which gets a trigger every time we draw. And Ominous Seas, which also can add counters to eventually make an 8/8 blue Kraken. And we can typically make an 8/8 way ahead of curve in this particular deck. So how does this play into the draw to win style and not towards what it might look like, which looks a little bit more mid-range? Well, first of all, how do we consider the way that this is prone to disruption? Unlike a lot of the other decks I've shown you, there really is not a single key card. Like, if they take away our Glinthorn Buccaneer, we can get other cards. They take away our Kraken, we can get others. Ominous Seas, it doesn't really matter. Riel the Everwise doesn't really matter. We're not centered around any single card, so we already have built the deck with that in mind. Unlike kind of a Phoenix deck, wherein if they can exile your Phoenixes, you're pretty screwed. Or if they can somehow exile your graveyard, you're also pretty screwed. Many cards achieve multiple goals. So like, Ominous Seas and Nadir Kraken and Glinthorn Buccaneer basically turn our card draw into also win condition. So we have that going on for us as well. Exponential curves. So that's not quite as true in our deck, especially when it comes to tempo. We're not like adding lands to the field, but we are like a play more, win more style deck. The more that we are drawing and discarding, the more that we're getting more gas to win the next turn and so on. It's very common that we end our turn with 6 or 7 cards in our hand, even very well into the late game. That includes against control decks that can counterspell us and get rid of our Cathartic Reunion effects. It doesn't matter. We have so much card draw in the deck that we will get it back eventually. So we definitely have that kind of thing going on for us where we have the card advantage of a control deck without actually being a control deck. We tap out on our turn. That's pretty true for this deck. We can hold up some interaction on their turn, but we are leaning heavily into that. Even with our Thirst for Meaning, for example, which we could play at instant speed on our opponent's turn, typically we want to play it on our own turn anyway, in case we draw into like a sorcery speed spell or a creature spell that we would really want to put down that turn. Solitaire style, high synergy. So we have a lot of high synergy among our own cards, which means that a lot of our plays are thinking about the interactions of our own cards with themselves and not thinking about putting a big threat on the board and, countering something that our opponent has done. So this really does play into that solitaire style. We want to give ourselves a lot of cards that give us a huge amount of options so we can play that game of solitaire and come up with the actual most optimal solution. And again, we have that insane card draw, so having a large variety of options is quite good for us. You may even notice that there are some Nombos in the deck. So Ox of Agonist, which you can't really clearly see right now, that one seems like, and it is, a Nombo with Riel the Everwise, because in order to escape it for 2 mana, which would give you a 2 mana 5/3, we also need to exile 8 cards, which means we're going to be hitting some of our sorceries and instants, but we don't really care. The fact that we have that option is huge, and it has this very relevant ETB trigger that allows us to discard our entire hand and draw 3 cards. So even if we have Riel the Everwise down, we probably still want to do this, because that's a huge amount of card draw if we have any number of cards in our hand. That's the 3 on itself, plus however many cards we discard, we get back with Riel's trigger. Pretty amazing. Finally, disrupting our opponent's strategies. So how are we doing that in this deck? Well, Channeled Force is a really wonderful example of that. Normally, I would not recommend playing this card. This card reads, as an additional cost, discard X. So that means we get to discard as many cards as we want. Then we draw X cards. Then we deal X damage to up to 1 creature or planeswalker. So this combos off again really well with Riel, but also with Glinthorn Buccaneer, Nadir Kraken, and Ominous Seas. It can remove a very irrelevant blocker to us, so that's one way that we're disrupting our opponent, is mostly removal with this deck, unsurprisingly, because we are more creature focused and hitting their face. We have Shock to remove stuff as well. It also fills our bin with instants and sorceries for whatever that's worth. And Go for Blood is a huge part of how we interact with our opponent's board. We can have 2 things: fight each other to remove something of theirs, or kill a creature after it's already blocked one of our other ones, or we could just cycle it in order to discard and draw a card and get that loot effect as well. So yeah, not really a control deck, right? Combo deck, and not a control deck either. And you could describe it as mid-range, but I think that that is not a great description for the deck, because we're not about top decking, we're not about just having super high value plays on top, and we have huge card advantage. So I really do think it's more useful to think about this deck in this new type of archetype way. This is a draw to win deck. It has different properties, it has different things that we're trying to design around and deck build around. And when we start to think about, oh yeah, we need to have disruption because we have huge card advantage, that's when you start thinking about Channeled Force. That's when this card becomes better. That's when you start thinking about Go for Blood in a different kind of way than you normally might in this deck. When you add a Clear the Mind, because you realize you're going to have huge card advantage. This is not just a totally dead card, it's fine, we can run this in order to protect ourselves a little bit from Milldown. So what are the takeaways for deck building, and how does this apply to Mono Blue Devotion? Like if we were trying to take a bad combo deck, say, or a bad mid-range deck or whatever, and consider, wait a minute, is this draw to win? What would we need to consider to update it and change it according to this archetype with Blue Devotion in mind? So number 1, be mindful of the fact that you have an exponential curve. So that means at least that your card draw is your progress towards your win condition and how that functions. But sometimes that's also tempo. In this case, we do have that constant curve upwards in the form of Nyx Lotus with our tempo as well. But all of this relies on a 3 or more card combo. You need the Nyx Lotus itself, you need some card or cards that give you enough blue devotion to make it worth your while, and you need Gadwick or some way to get Gadwick into your hand in order to take advantage of that card draw. So, being mindful of our curve, this is not a good way for our curve to rely on, because we could be curving, and then all of a sudden, boom, nothing, all of a sudden, absolutely nothing. And you will see that in Blue Devotion. You can very easily stall out the deck. That's not as true with these other draw to win decks. You really have huge card advantage, and even if your stuff gets removed, then you can still keep playing. That's the other takeaway here. Think about resiliency. Combo should be more fragile and is less resilient than draw to win. Your draw to win decks don't need to be as fragile as a true combo deck. So think about resiliency, how to make your deck more resilient. Again, if your opponent disrupts your Nyx Lotus, or like your one creature that's providing you your blue devotion, or they counterspell your Gadwick, then you're just dead in the water, and you're probably going to lose the game after that point. Do not try to combo off or win the same turn. Don't design your deck around doing that. Like, for example, Song of Creation, Cheerios. If you can't support that as a true combo, don't half-ass it. Play draw to win. Draw to win does not need to win the same turn. Doesn't even need to win the turn after that. We're much more resilient than that. So don't try to play it like a combo. Be mindful of silver bullets or build around cards which make us prone to disruption. Again, Nyx Lotus. But there's lots of silver bullets. Narset. How do you get around Narset? Our Risen Reef can get around that because it doesn't actually do card draw. Our other decks can get around that by hitting that Planeswalker. So just being mindful of that. Which you really should be doing in any deck, but much more so in a combo style deck, which draw to win is close enough that we need to be considerate of that. Provide yourself with a variety of cards which give you many options. Now this deck, this is another way where it's not a good draw to win deck. We don't have that many options. Like, our cards pretty much do one thing in the deck. Omen of the Sea is only really useful to find your combo pieces. If you already have your combo assembled, you don't want to see this card. It doesn't do anything for you. Corridor Monitor is really only useful after you've already comboed off. That's kind of unfortunate. I guess it's a 2-mana 1/4 blocker, but otherwise, it's only useful to untap your Nyx Lotus. A lot of these cards are very narrow, and there's not a lot of variety in strategy. So if I'm looking for a very specific kind of out, then I don't have a lot of opportunity to draw into that out, because that may not even be in my deck. We only have 2 counterspells in the form of Sublime Epiphany. Can I try to draw into it and still have mana enough to hold it up? And I only have 2 of them in the deck. Am I even going to find it? To its credit, this particular list has 2 Brazen Borrowers and 3 Baron, so there is a little bit of option there, like a little bit of variety in option, but not a whole lot. Most of it is card advantage and card selection and, win more, like Corridor Monitor. It's just win more cards. So that's where I would make a change here. If I was going to play this as a draw to win deck, there's just not enough variety of options. Finally, disruption of your opponent. Again, there are a few disruption cards. There's 3 Baron, 2 Brazen Borrower, and 2 Sublime Epiphany, but there's not really enough for what this particular deck needs in a draw-to-win deck. We don't even really have a lot of decent blockers. Corridor Monitor could become a blocker, but it's not, again, it's not a very good blocker when you compare it to, say, Merfolk's Secret Keeper. So I'm not sure I would run Secret Keeper in this list, but I'm just saying, it's not doing its job as well as other cards could if the reason that it's here is to disrupt our opponent. So that's where this deck also falls short as a draw to win deck. I do think that this deck wants to be draw to win more than it wants to be combo, and that's why people design decks like this that are never going to be even tier 2 lists. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, but seriously, this is like a thing that I've been considering for the last 4 or 5 sets, and I've been starting to accumulate some theories and hypotheses about why this might be and really testing them, and I've really learned a lot in the last 6 months or however long it's been since I really started playing around with this concept, and I wanted to get it out there. I feel like I now have enough knowledge to be able to put it into words and kind of prove it with graphs or whatever with the curves to justify this as a 6th archetype and why that actually matters in deck building. I'm really finding that question enter into my mind a lot more. Like when I'm designing a certain deck, like sometimes I'm designing tempo and I'm like, wait a minute, is this really draw to win? Or I'm designing combo, that's much more common. And then I'm like, wait a minute, am I just designing draw to win in the end? And then I find that there's often these helpful things for me to start to consider to make my deck better. discard to win. When I started designing this deck, I was thinking about it as more combo than anything else. And then I realized it was draw to win, and so I'm like, cool, I need to add disruption to the deck. And that totally improved it and made it a million times better. I was like, right, I need to have more variety of options. I had Clear the Mind, I had 2 Ox of Agonist, I removed some Crackling Drake, and it just became like wildly better. So I do think that there's a ton of value in this, having this conversation. But let me know if you just disagree with me too. I'd love to hear that. Let me know if you think of other decks that fall into this style, or other thoughts that you have about this. I don't normally make videos like this, but this was just something that was very near and dear to me that I wanted to share to you. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next deck.